Afternoon, everybody. How we doing today? Uh, it's a Wednesday, 10:30 or so-ish. Uh, Today I want to talk a little bit about the blues. And I'm not going to talk about it in the sense of the traditional blues, the Muddy Waters, the Howlin' Wolves, the Lightning Hopkins. That blues is very much the essence and the deep source of the blues. But for me, there's a second definition of the blues. And I've discussed this with numerous people, musicians included, and most people seem to agree and often think this way themselves. You can be informed by the blues in almost anything you play to some extent. And you can extrapolate from the blues, but you can also borrow from its guttural, honest place of emotion. And that improvised expression via a horn is as immediate and blues-filled as a guitar player singing the blues and expressing the standard blues chord progressions. Jazz players, I feel like especially, but there's some rock players as well, are able to sometimes express a blues and a sorrow on a different chord progression, but it's still inspired and driven by the blues. And a great example of that to me is Ammons Sonny Stitt record. And a lot of these players to me can play standards that are based on pop's chords, but sometimes they'll diminish that note to give it that bluesier tone, but oftentimes they're playing the standard chord progressions even, but because it's such a loose emoting from the gut, it still has a blues center to it. And so there's a distinction there. It's not the same, but it is the same. It's not the same technically on the musical notes on the page. Sometimes they're not playing straight, 12-bar blues, 8-bar blues. They're not doing standard, it's a 1-4-5, I think it is. But they're still expressing from the same fuel source. That sorrow, that anger, that disappointment. A guy like David Gilmour, even from Pink Floyd, especially in his later years, a lot of his soloing, regardless of what scale it's in, has a lot of blues throughout it. He's great at bending notes and finding that tone that's just thick and deep and saturated with an oily melancholy. I kind of like that. Listen to him. They're shifting gears there. That's the blues. You can hear that on a blues stage anywhere. That's how synonymous the blues and jazz is. And the blues is such an interesting thing in how it has the ability to creep into other facets of music. There's much more standard traditional blues, that kind of just a grinding, repetitious loop that a guy's just expressing words on top of telling you a story. Lightning Hopkins is one of my favorite examples. Howlin' Wolf, those guys are just narrating over a very basic repeating groove. It almost becomes a drone. It's just droning, and it's so basic, but so effortless to express on. And for me, part of what makes these guys able to play the blues in almost any format is the pieces they play the blues with. They know them like the back of their hand. So as well as a guitar player from the traditional blues sense knows the progression, and so he doesn't think about it. He can think about saying what's on his mind today, right? That's the blues. Well, guys like this can take standards like Red Sails in the Sunset and My Foolish Heart, and because they know these chord changes so well, it's an effortless blues. And that, to me, is one of the defining lines in jazz, especially in the 50s and the 60s, as composition becomes more and more a predominant part of what the young cats are doing. It makes the guys who are playing from just a blues, I don't need new chords and arrangements to express my sorrow. This is the vehicle, guess where I need to go. Any chord changes will work. Whether it's a standard blues or whether it's me just taking a song that everybody's going to know, I don't need to reinvent melody and harmony and create all this new composition, because that comes from a mental, as I've said before, more of an ego-driven place that's less driven by the sorrow and fuel of a man's life. And almost on some level, it says my sorrow is diminished enough for my intellect to take over. And some of these older black jazz players probably were comfortable enough financially where they could have abandoned the blues on some level. But guys like Sonny Stitt, guys like Ammons, these brothers, look at them. Tell me that dude wasn't coy. Tell me he wasn't a flirtatious little And this one, he more the silent killer. He's going to lay back and give the girl them big eyes, them Ammons eyes. They both got girls on the mind. And as I've said many times before, the only real melody or tonic for the blues is sex. The mansion on the hill ain't coming. The Cadillac might be coming someday. But as for today, I'm going to give me some jelly roll. And that's the important thing about sex. It plays a very important part in liberating the heart and the soul of the oppressed. It's a great balm. It's a great medication. Something you can't really ever take from me is that freedom and that liberty. And it was always an issue, even in the days of slavery. You know, castration was something that happened. There was all this tension revolving around sex in the home with black migrant workers, with the slave population. Sex was always seen as a way to take away their ultimate last freedom. So, in saying that, there's a lot of things I'm going to say. This is a blues-driven record or a blues-driven track. It doesn't mean you can expect a bunch of traditional blues standards in that sense. It's going to more say these guys are coming from the source of the blues, and their only real concern right now, they're playing in duality, that's kind of fun. There's moments here where I'm pretty clear on who's Ammons and who's Stitt. There's other moments where I'm not sure. They are both great players. Like I said, they're both very much driven by the blues. Stitt is a bit sharper and brighter, a bit more rooted in bebop, great at tempos. Ammons is even gutsier than Stitt. He's more bluesy. He's more gospel. Ammons is the ultimate storyteller with less flair. Stitt has a lot of flair because he's got that special viewpoint of himself. You know, watch this. There's a loop-de-loop. I got loop-de-loops. I'll pop a wheelie for you. He's got that kind of bravado in a lot of his playing throughout the years. Ammons is more straightforward, just gonna kick you in the chin. Just gotta get this off my chest. Open your ears. Open your ears. Argo is really one of the great unsung labels in the jazz canon that today's collector really ignores. And it's got its benefits. It means a lot of Argo records are not that expensive. Hear ye, get your Argos now while the getting's good. Because eventually, today's collector is going to run out of Blue Notes and Prestiges. And Argos are going to start becoming more in demand. And the truth is, there's a number of early Argos that have not been reissued that fetch darn good money already. The Paul Gonsalves, the Clark Terry, those records will jump into the hundreds pretty quick. You know, the Gonsalves is probably the one that's usually the Art Farmer record. I'm going to show you one of his records next, and that record can go for pretty good bucks. But Ammons and Stitt were very congruous, and they're one of the great duos of battling sax player combinations. You know, you got Lockjaw Davison and Johnny Griffin. You got Al Cohn, Zut Sims. But Stitt and Ammons was another one of those ones that you would go to the bar over in the ghetto on a Friday night because you heard that down in Southside Chicago, Sonny Stitt and Gene Ammons are going to be blowing. And these are some heavy blues cats. And you can just tell their personalities. They both are expressing loads of personality in those photographs. Ammons was a Prestige guy at this point, and I think this is one of the records where there was a conflict with Prestige over who was going to release it. The rhythm section is pretty unknown. Some Chicago guys, John Huston, Charles Williams, and George Brown. And it says George Brown, John Huston, and Charles Williams in that order, which I'm guessing means George's piano, John's bass, Charles's drums. That's generally how they're going to be listed. But again, this is a record you can find for $10. Sometimes less. Maybe today that's gone up a little, but I bet you there's still copies on Discogs right now for under 20. And in record stores especially, you'll find stuff like Gene Ammons and Sonny Stitt for under $20 on a regular basis. And later pressings will always be under 10. Almost always. You know, I haven't shopped a lot the last couple of years in person in stores. I have some, but not much. Record worth finding. You'll just enjoy it. It'll stick with you. It'll be like potatoes. And you can eat potatoes every day. You know what I mean? There's certain parts of that plate you don't want to take that in every day. You know what I mean? There's certain foods you want once a year. Cotton candy, I want that one time a year and I'm good. You can't live on that. Feel me? But there's certain foods you can eat on a regular basis. Potatoes is one of them. And this is a potatoes record. This is a record you can put on any time. And it's not going to conflict with your headspace. It's not going to be at odds with your emotional state. It's just going to be a kind of complimentary mood piece. And it's loose. These guys have fun together. I feel like Stitt and Ammons, and they play together a couple on Verve as well, in probably 61, 62. This is probably 59, maybe 60. Argo number 697. And Argo has about 150 records before it switches over to Cadet due to a lawsuit with a UK label named Argo. And that whole 150 albums is outstanding. And I will be honest when I say probably only about half of it is in today's jazz canon. It doesn't say the other stuff's not great. There's a lot of unknown, obscure Argo titles. Dozens. And it actually gets harder and harder for me to measure that as I get more and more familiar with all those records and all those artists. It becomes harder for me to remember what does the average jazz fan know here. And I think it's probably about half, to be honest. There's a lot of titles in there that unless you're an Argo guy, you haven't ever heard of Jess Bonnier. You know, I mean, there's a lot of guys on those on Argo that came from the Midwest that got one or two records on Argo, and for the most part, the average jazz collector hasn't heard of them. And I'm here to tell you, anytime you see an Argo record, grab it. Argo ends by 60, 61, switches to Cadet. So if you see something that's on Argo, it's going to be from 55, 56 really, to 60, 61. There's a period there where they kind of have them coming out on both, but anything from that period is great. Really well made, good sounding. The old pressings play well, even with some surface scuffing, you won't hear them. record that is completely underappreciated in the jazz canon today, as most Argo stuff is. And there's really only it's a small number of records on Argo that have real broad acceptance as being part of the jazz canon for even the novice jazz fan. And certainly one of those records that has elevated itself into the heavens of the jazz canon is Art Farmer. He makes 2 records here on Argo. This is number 678, so probably also 58, 59. Argo's not quite as prolific as some of the labels, but like Blue Note, recorded in September 21, 22, and 23. Oddly enough, it doesn't have the year there. I'm going to say 59. I'm going to go with 59 on this. Great stuff. Absolutely fantastic. With them on this session is Art Farmer, Tommy Flanagan on the piano, Tommy Williams on the bass, and Al Heath on the drums. So it's a quartet session. And he's one of the first trumpet players that you kind of discover after Miles. Before Lee Morgan, for most people, I think. Before even Freddie Hubbard, depending on where you come in. But Art Farmer has some pretty prominent early releases on Prestige that I think elevates his status fairly high. And he plays very much in the sound and style of Miles. One thing I want to mention on Miles, I have a lot of people thinking I don't like Miles. That's far from what I've ever said. I love Miles. I play his records at gigs all the time. He's a wonderful ambassador for the music. He's the first name most people will come across. All I've ever said about him is his status today is inflated and he's overrated in terms of how much of a giant he was in that time frame. We see him today as being way above Muhammad Ali and the rest of the boxers. But in the time frame of that day, I've read a lot of liner notes. There wasn't a lot of cats saying I want to play like Miles. There wasn't a lot of people talking about Miles and as being the most innovative player in the music. That was Monk, that was Parker, that was Mingus, that was Ellington. There's a lot of guys getting Coltrane. A lot of guys are getting credit for being great, innovative, and people that wanted to emulate and play like so-and-so. Miles isn't that in the kingdom yet. And I don't think anybody in 1955 being asked 60, 70 years from now, who's going to be the biggest name in jazz? Who's going to be remembered most from this time frame? I don't think a lot of people would have thrown Miles Davis out there in 1955. By 1960, he probably would have become more of one of the options people would have said because of the power of Columbia and that distribution. But in 55, when he's still on Prestige, I think there would have been a dozen guys they probably would have thrown out there. And Miles might have been in the mix to some degree. But Miles had a young guy, Coltrane, that if you read a lot of the liner notes, a lot of the Miles records even, Coltrane's getting a lot of the buzz. Miles' records are great, but this young kid Coltrane that he has on these records, this guy's outstanding. You know, he's a bit of an upstart in a way. So I don't want to ever come across people that I don't like Miles. And that's what's insane to me, is I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we have to broaden our jazz palettes and recognize he's a small percentage of the jazz canon. And there's a lot of things that are equal to Miles. And a lot of guys that were equally innovative and some more so. And there's a lot of players who play the trumpet more trumpet than Miles plays. But Art, back to Art, he plays in the Miles style in some ways. And I wouldn't say he was emulating Miles because they're very much contemporaries. But Chet Baker, Art Farmer, and Miles Davis are that soft-toned, mid-tempo, not aggressive, not fiery. It's almost a bit cloudy and milky, the sound they play, even without a mute. Farmer here's a little bit fuzzy, a little bit warm. And if you listen to the brightness of a Hubbard or a Clifford Brown, it's very bright. Roy Eldridge is bright. Even a guy like Sweets Edison, bright, clear, crystalline tone. With a guy like Art Farmer, with Miles Davis, with Chet Baker, they're playing less, putting less fuel into the engine, and so we're more coasting, and the trumpet sounds very different in that mid-blowing sound style than it does when it's got a guy putting full velocity into it. So if you like Miles, if you like Chet Baker, you will like Art Farmer. He's lyrical. He's filled with a deep sorrow. He's a deep cat. He's just got this essence to him that has kind of what Hank Mobley has. A kind of a calm, soothing, it's gonna be okay narrative. And oddly enough, I think some of Farmer and Mobley's best work is together. There's really a simpatico between their tones. Softer, fuzzier, middle of the range. I think Mobley with Farmer is fantastic. If anything, Mobley makes Farmer a little bit more aggressive, and Farmer gives Mobley the encouragement to be very melodic and centered. When Mobley's playing with a Lee Morgan or even a Donald Byrd, it gets a little bit more aggressive and a little bit more hard bop. And Mobley's a guy who's as much influenced by the blues as he is by hard bop. And he crosses and straddles that line very efficiently throughout his career. He can play either really well. And Farmer's, again, that guy. And there's a lot of blues even in what he's saying right now. And so part of the Argo story is the blues side of things. There's not a lot of compositional jazz on Argo. There's not a lot of free-driven avant-garde. It's really before that era. It's, again, Chicago's a town city rooted in the blues, rooted in the black gospel, rooted in R&B and early soul music. And so when you have that Chicago atmosphere around you, it's going to cloak you in this wrapping of the blues. And it's a wonderful, informed sound. I don't think this one was actually recorded in Chicago. It might have been, but we'll see. I think it was recorded in New York, but recorded in New York City. And that's what some of these Chicago and LA labels even will do. Some of VJ stuff was recorded in New York, not in Chicago. Some of Argo stuff was recorded in New York, not Chicago. They also have their own studio in Chicago, but I think it depends on who they signed, who they're working with, who they're playing with live in the clubs. Farmer probably had a New York engagement, so they booked him in somewhere in New York, and they shipped the tapes to Chicago and pressed them. It's a great session. It's a record. It's a beautiful condition, by the way. A beautiful old pressing that I got in a store. I think I probably paid $30 for it or so. It's easy, probably $100 record now, 10 years later. Just beautiful. Flanagan's wonderful on this. The contemplative nature of Farmer. One of the things about Miles is there's a negative energy to him. And I think you listen to enough Miles, you start to pick up on his acerbic nature. Miles is kind of a bitter cat. And it's almost draining in some ways listening to him for me at times. Because he's just sanguine. He's just lemon and pissed off. And he comes from more wealth and affluence than almost all these other cats, which means he's kind of bordering that line away from the blues and struggle. And now he's dealing with the struggle of being the bourgeoisie, which is a whole different type of malaise. And being bourgeoisie definitely gives you a malaise of its own. And it can inform the blues from its own place, but it's a different sounding blues. So anyway, Argo is responsible for some of the great soul-driven, blues-driven jazz records. And if we don't ever forget that Argo is the sister label of Chess Records, Phil and Leonard Chess in Chicago. And Phil and Leonard Chess and the Chess label is the home of the Chicago blues. Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Little Walter, It's Sonny Boy Williams. There's a long list of guys that recorded at Chess Records, and so this was their jazz division that they launched. It was initially going to be named Martari Records, which was the putting together of Phil, Arlander, and Chess's kids' names. Phil and Mark, I think it was, and Phil and Terry. Sorry, Mark and Terry. But for some reason, they abandoned that after one record. Al Hibbler has a version of that on Martari out there, which I found recently, and then they went back and that got reissued as Argo, and everything forward from that's Argo. Why there's one Martari, I can't remember why they didn't use it. It might have been, I don't recall, but interesting time. Small businesses, small labels, and the world was so much less global, so much less at your fingertips. You know, if you had to use the name that you couldn't use and it was copyrighted, it wasn't like the internet corrected you within 10 hours and said, oh, you can't use that. It might take it 5 years for the legislation and then the paperwork trail to reach back to whoever, no, you can't use that name. And then, you know, it was a different age in those days, Wild West of sorts. So anyway, if you find this record, you should definitely grab it. It's, if you enjoy records like Miles, the musings of Miles, 54, 55 Miles, where he's playing, not with Coltrane yet. If you enjoy 7 Steps to Heaven, Miles, this is that. It's pretty clear to me how much Miles' music is impacted by his players. There's a big difference between Coltrane Miles and not Coltrane Miles. There's a big difference between Wayne Shorter Miles and not Wayne Shorter Miles. Those are very different sounding things. And so this is more Miles, where he doesn't have that fiery saxophone player leading the arrangements and the sessions. This is on par with a lot of that great early Miles stuff. Farmer's got a great discography. Almost anything you can find by Art Farmer's worth having. Woman Gigi Grice is fantastic. His stuff with Curtis Fuller and Benny Golson, the Jazz Tet, also on Argo, 6061, outstanding stuff. So Farmer's someone you definitely want to dig into. He's one of the top players of that era of the, like I said, the mild mannered trumpets, the creamy, soft tone. Some of the tracks, I'll just list off real quick here. So Beats My Heart for You, Goodbye Old Girl, Out of the Past, a Benny Golson number, Younger Than Springtime, The Best Thing for You Is Me, I'm a Fool to Want You, That Old Devil Called Love. So there's some standards in there, some originals, Irving Berlin, Rodgers and Hammerstein, George Gershwin, Adler and Ross, and then of course the Benny Golson one. Great stuff. So the blues, like I said, it's more than just playing the blues progression. It's an expression of your soul, and the blues fuels and informs the player. And when they're not informed by the blues, they're informed by something else. And it could be intellect, it could be sexuality. I've done an episode on this before, but the blues has a specific feel to it. It's loose, it's not rehearsed, it's not full of changes and innovation and trying to be impressive in a compositional sense. It's not thinking about the music in that way. It's thinking about the music as just a framework for me to get something off my chest. And that's what the blues is in a lot of jazz senses. So when I said the blues, that's often what I'm saying about. I'm not saying they don't often play the blues as well in a traditional format. They do. But there's a lot of other stuff that's actually blues driven as well. So that wraps up these two records. 2 Argo records that are outstanding. I'm going to jump into how to clean your records coming up, one of my episodes. I'm going to show you a couple old records. We're going to clean them up and see if we can hear a difference. I can tell you that it does make a pretty big difference, but I want to jump into that right now. Check out Patreon. Pledge your support if you have it, $5 a month. It'll give you access to the Jazz Journal, a great little piece with a bunch of videos from me and my friends. It's worth the $5 in itself. Also, there's merchandise available at Teespring. I'll put a link to both of those in the description. There's great stuff. Jazz Shepherd, Jazz Vinyl Club, the Facebook group. Wear your jazz colors proud. One of the shirts actually says, "I survived 2020 listening to jazz vinyl." That's pretty cool, I think, myself. I got one coming in the mail. But y'all be safe. We'll talk to y'all soon. Peace.